I welcome you all, and I welcome the guest for today, Rukmini. This is the first of our speaker series that we have for the third edition, of which the special theme is gender responsive policy and gender and development. Uh, our speaker for today, Rukmini, is a independent data journalist based in Chennai. She was the first data editor of The Hindu and HuffPost India. She writes on socio-economic and political issues with a focus on inequality, gender, and caste. She is a recipient of Likho Award in 2019, an honorable mention at the Chameli Devi Jain Awards for outstanding women journalists in 2020, and an Emergent Ventures COVID-19 India Prize in 2020. First of all, Rukmini, thanks a lot for accepting our invitation and coming for the talk. Our intention was to call speakers who would be, able to give a different perspective, an on-ground perspective to the cohort. The present cohort, as well as a few of our seniors, would also be joining today, the first cohort of ISPP. So with this, I hand over to you. Please take forward.
A happy Women's Day to all the women joining here. I think a lot of us can feel quite jaded sometimes about Women's Day, but if it gives us the opportunity to think about how far we've come and how far we still need to go, then, I'll take that chance to have a day to reflect upon this. As Mana said, I'm a data journalist. My job is to tell stories using data. One of my areas of interest and focus has been gender over the years. And one of the thing that I wanted to talk to you about today is what gender can tell us about, what data can tell us about gender disparities in India and the limits of what data can tell us. So we could think about ways that we need to think about how we can go beyond the data, reading between the lines of the data to figure out all that data cannot tell us. I'll try and keep it quite short, and I really look forward to your questions at the end of this. Okay. Sorry. Okay. So there's 5 big areas to do with gender data that I'm going to look at. These are the 5. There's labor force participation, crime, voting, demographic change over time, and health. There's a reason that these are the 5 I'm looking at, and there's a reason that I'm ending with health, trying to be a bit forward-looking, and I'll get to all of those in a minute. So the first thing I wanted to talk about is the labor force participation rate. So as you'd probably know is that India's labor force participation rate is among the lowest in the world. The only countries that give us company there at the bottom are Arab world nations, some Arab world nations. So that red line you see right towards the left, that's India. A little to the right of us is Pakistan with a slightly better labor force participation rate. And substantially further to the right is Bangladesh in yellow. As you go along, you see a host of sub-Saharan African, Eastern Asian, European nations. So it's not to be dismissed of. It's pretty serious to be here in the global distribution, especially with incomes as they are in India. The earnings that a woman could bring in is not something that families don't need in India. So it really needs consideration about why this is happening. This is ILO data. So the other thing that's worrying that's happening over time is that not only is female labor force participation rate low in India, it's also falling. Look at the rates over time. Labor force participation rates always tend to be higher in rural than urban areas, but from such a low level as it was already, to be falling further over time is really the thing that's got people worried. This is a map from a Mint article. Some of this follows the dimensions that you'd expect. As you can see, the Gangetic Plain over there is really the biggest cause of concern. I'd say the southern states towards the Bay of Bengal side are a little better, and we need to think about some of the reasons why. There's a lot of nuance within regional disparities. These aren't clear north-south stories, but there is something going on over here. So that's what the data tells us, and it's obviously a big cause of concern. Economists think about it, public policy people think about it. And there's a few things that I feel that so most of the numbers that we have, or the insights that we have from the numbers, come from the National Sample Survey, which measures employment and unemployment. And when you say that these are women who are not in the labor force, what they're saying is it's not unemployment. What they're saying is that they're neither employed nor unemployed nor looking for work. Um, they are they don't count themselves as seeking work at all. So there's a lot to think about why this is happening. One is, of course, the clear issue of what is paid work and what is unpaid work. And this is something we would have all sort of instinctively known already, that women are spending most of their day doing unpaid domestic work, but now we can quantify it to some extent. So in 2019, India had a time use survey after 20 years, which is something that many other countries do, and it's very valuable. It basically asks men and women how they spent every minute of their day. And what we know from the time use survey is that women spend 42% of their day on women spend 4% of their day on paid work, of the minutes in their day on paid work, and 17% on unpaid household work. Men, on the other hand, spend 18% of their day on paid work, but here's the other side of it: they spend less than 2% of their day on unpaid work. So that, of course, if there's a question of what are women doing if they're not in the paid workforce or looking for work, this is the answer. What they're doing is attending to unpaid domestic chores, cooking, cleaning, housework, childcare, all of that. Sorry, just a minute. There's also the question of, does the NSSO do a good enough job of capturing work? Work in India is complicated. The sort of jobs that many of us would do, which we would classify as 9 to 5 clearly defined jobs, are a minority in India. And a lot of people do a combination of jobs. They might not even realize sometimes that what they're doing is paid work. Some of it is paid work that goes back into the household enterprise. It's much more amorphous. So the NCAER, the National Council for Applied Economic Research, tried an experimental survey in which they asked a small sample of women the same NSSO questions about work, but then they also asked more probing questions. Do you do this? When you're doing this, are you also doing that? What are you? And they found that it showed higher rates of labor force participation. So their argument is, the argument of the people conducting the survey is that better questions would reveal higher labor force participation. But then there is, of course, the counter issue of, well, all NSSO questioning could be better. If you pick one set of questions and do a better job of them, it might not be fair to compare it against the rest of the data set. So it's likely that some paid work is being missed, but whether this changes the relative balance of things, I'm not very sure about that. Then it's important to think about the why of why this is happening, to then be able to think about solutions. So when the NSSO asks people why they're not seeking work, the most common answer given by men is because they're studying. So that means that they've captured men in that pre-workforce age. The most common answer given by women is that they're attending to domestic duties. So in my view, there's nuance within this, but the central question is not a big mystery. This is what women are doing. So then you have to think about whether things like childcare, better childcare, whether things like crashes, whether if that would have an impact on labor force participation. And then there's also the question of what sort of jobs could pull women into the workforce. So one of the things that we've seen is, over time there's a slight decline in casual labor and an increase in salaried work. The decline in casual labor is quite well offset by the increase in salaried work for men, but much less so for women. So they're sort of dropping out of casual labor, but perhaps they're not able to find the salaried work that they're looking for. That's one direction we could think about. And the other thing that economists like Sher Verick of the ILO have suggested is that, you know, it's sort of a combination of prevailing socio-economic sort of social forces as well as economic forces, and this sort of all comes together in the fact that women are ghettoized in slow-moving sectors of the economy. They might be ghettoized in those for sociological reasons, but then economic shifts have meant that those sectors are not growing. So the transformation could need to be both economic and social in that respect. So, as I said, I wanted to focus on what the data can and cannot tell us. So, if this is what the data is able to tell us about labor force participation for women, here are some thoughts I had about what it's possibly not telling us that we might need to think about. The next thing I want to talk about is crime, which is a totally different track from labor numbers. As we all know, sexual violence against women is something of deep concern. In the years after 2012, there was a long overdue conversation around sexual assault that began. And in terms of data, the conversation is usually anchored around the NCRB, the National Crime Records Bureau. What the NCRB is a collection of FIRs, first information reports from across the country, aggregated at the district, state, and national level. I mean, that's essentially what the NCRB is. So, one thing to think about is we all know that there's underreporting. Most of us have probably, been relieved of a phone that we've never reported to the police. So, what share of the universe of actual crime can we imagine that the NCRB is capturing? Um, and should we worry that this is a big issue with sexual assault? So, in an interesting study done in Rajasthan, Abhijit Banerjee and others found that yes, the bulk of crime is not reported to the police, but underreporting is far higher for things like theft, property crime, and lower for things like violent crimes, which include both sexual assault and molestation. This is actually borne out in a way by some other reporting as well. The NCRB is an aggregation of FIRs, so it doesn't tell you anything in a sort of socio-economic, sociological way. But the National Family Health Survey, which is a household survey, asks households and women about things going on in their lives, including sexual violence and physical violence. If you compare the NCRB data for that year with the NFHS data for the same year, what you find is that both actual violence in terms of what is actually reported by women tends to be higher in northern states than in southern states. But what happens is that the reporting, so the level of underreporting is higher in states with worse gender indicators. So what you might find after the NCRB report comes out is usually you'll often find that the highest reported crime is from Delhi or Kerala, but there's definitely a reporting bias issue over there, and that's an important caveat when you start to think about whether some places more or less unsafe for women. The media reporting of violence statistics is a huge bugbear of mine, and I think this is the key underpinning factor that I think that we miss when we do this sort of reporting. So the other issue with the NCRP, as I said, is that it's an aggregation of FIRs, and as I have learned from covering police stations earlier in my career, I know how far from truth the FIR can be. This doesn't simply mean falsification; it just means that what's going on at the police station at the time of lodging of an FIR is a very complex interplay of Indian social factors, Indian life playing out, and I know how far it can be from the actual truth sometimes. So, what I did in 2014 is I looked at all of the sexual assault cases, IPC 376, that were fully tried, which means a conviction or an acquittal came about during one calendar year. That was about 600 cases or so, and I tried to analyze them for what the distance between what the FIR was saying and what was going on in court. So I'm just giving you a view of. Um, Sorry, I seem to have moved back a little. Okay, I was just trying to give you a view of my process, which is very unglamorous, that sort of color coded, very basic spreadsheet. So here's what I found when I looked at 583 trials in all. In 123 of them, they could not be tried fully because the complainant either did not appear or turned hostile. Our media understanding again of turning hostile is usually one of pressure, and that's entirely possible. But in many of these cases, it was also the woman just saying, "This is not what I said in the FIR. This is simply not what I was saying. This is what the police have noted, but I didn't say this at all." Then the largest individual sort of row in this was cases involving consensual relationships between sometimes intercaste and sometimes interreligious couples. And in those cases, a case of kidnapping and sexual assault was usually put against the man. Um, then there was this issue of breach of promise to marry, which is very much a factor. It exists. There's no point wishing it away. Um, and because I was doing this in the aftermath of 2012, when it was really a horrific stranger assault that had really frightened us all so deeply, I was pretty shocked to see that just 12 of the trials in that year, including the 2012 Delhi case, involved strangers or alleged strangers. So, what all of this did is that it made me realize that conversations about women's safety need to go hand in hand with conversations about women's autonomy, because there are trade offs between the two. And I think a lot of women experience this in their lives already. Being told that you can't go to this college or this workplace that's far from your home because of concerns about lack of safety in a bus. So I do think that if we come down too hard at one end of it, we're missing all of the trade-offs that are happening on the other end of it. So again, this is an example I wanted to give of the data and all that can lie in between. I'm going to speed through the rest of it. Okay, I'm going to really try and speed through this. I'm going to just show you one key graph, a couple of key graphs. So there's been a real revolution in Indian elections in the last few years, and that is in the form of female voters. So there's always been what do we call it? A gap between a gap in the sex ratio of electors. So more men. First of all, we have more men than women, more adult men than women, and then our issue is that more men tend to get onto the electoral rolls. That's something that the election commission really has worked hard on. So that gap is really narrowing. But then there's also the issue of who turns out to vote. And that's where you really see that female voters have been turning out in substantial numbers. And the effect of the two together is this real closing of the gap in turnout between men and women. Oh, sorry. Sorry, I usually do this by hand, so I'm having a bit of trouble. Just 1 minute. Sorry. Yes. Okay. So as I mentioned, this is this big revolution that's happened in voter lists, and it's had an impact on a number of things. What one of the sort of maybe complicated impact it's had is on opinion polling. So missing or not sampling women well enough is now a significant issue in opinion polling, because you're really going to miss a substantial number of voters. And this is likely to have happened in the 2020 Bihar Assembly elections. One of the leading pollsters who got it wrong later on said that he felt that the reason he got it wrong is because he had undersampled women, because on account of COVID there were much more men at home and they weren't permitting women to talk freely, and as a result he felt he had undersampled women who had voted at a higher rate than expected for Nitish's party. Which brings me to a point that I come to a little further on, which is, do men and women vote differently? Do they vote for different people? There isn't a very conclusive answer on this, but there are some parties and people who have an electoral advantage in the eyes of women. Nitish's party is one of those. the Biju Janata Dal is another. Then women-led parties clearly have an advantage numerically among women. So one of the interesting trends in the 2016 Tamil Nadu Assembly elections was that because Tamil Nadu has such a large number of registered women voters and high turnout, what it meant is that the actual number of women voting was higher in Tamil Nadu than men. And the CSDS post-election survey showed quite clearly that ADMK had, under Jayalalitha, had a substantial advantage in the eyes of women compared to the DMK, and the numbers were large enough to indicate that that could have been what tipped it in their favor because the vote share was relatively close. Of course, what that means is that what happens without that woman leader. So that's something to think about now for this election, for example. The other evidence on what women vote for tends to be mixed. In the Lokniti post-election surveys, men and women don't ask for don't say they're voting for very different things. They want their list, and their priority list is quite similar. There's some sort of correlational evidence that potentially women could be voting for different things, but it's not something we've captured very concretely. um, Another thing that there's some debate and not neat answers for is, what do women do when they're in power? So for example, at the panchayat level, do women choose different priority areas? There was a piece of research some time ago that suggested this, but that's now come into question, and I don't think we have a neat answer to that. What we do see, and we see this both in the case of SC reserve constituencies and constituencies reserved for women, is that once a constituency is reserved, the likelihood of it of the people of that constituency voting for either a Dalit person or a woman in the future, even when it is open, rise. So there's that sort of impact on the electorate to think about. Okay, I'm going to breeze through this again. Let me do it through these charts. One of the big demographic story in India really is of slowing fertility, which has slowed very fast. So what this means is that the number of women and average number of children an average woman is expected to have in her lifetime has dramatically dropped to the point that all of the south and west of the country have reached replacement levels of fertility from where level from which population growth will stabilize. One of the enduring myths about both demographic change and fertility in India has been that Muslim fertility is high and remains high. It is high, it's always been since independence, as among all groups that have lower incomes, less access to women's education and health. And just as it's changing for any group with growing incomes, better access to women's education and health, it's growing for Muslims as well at a higher than expected rate. So what you'll see in this chart, for example, is that Muslims in Kerala, those red bars in Kerala and Tamil Nadu, have a lower total fertility, the number of women per child, than Hindus in UP and Bihar, for example. So when incomes go up, they go up for everyone, though at differing levels. Access to education and health is when it is broad based, it means an improvement in fertility outcomes for everyone. So it's a combination of issues to think of rather than one alone. Here are some of the things that are in the between the lines issues, and I enjoy these because they complicate easy narratives. You would imagine that falling fertility would mean that women in India are having children later than ever, right? Anecdotally, you'd see all of us from my generation are having our children in our 30s, while our moms all had them in their 20s. You see that around you. But in India, the mean age at childbirth is actually falling, and that's extremely counterintuitive. But what's actually happening is that women are stopping having their children sooner than they did in the past. They had, all of the reasons that we know that people had large families meant that women continued having their children into their 30s and 40s, even if the first child was born very early. That's what a large family meant. So that's one counterintuitive number that I enjoy about India's fertility story. The other thing is that as we go on talking about fertility, the impact on the sex ratio is this isn't counterintuitive. This we should have seen it coming, and we're seeing it. So we're seeing that a small family, that girls are much more likely to be born in large families, families that would try repeatedly for a son, while boys are more likely to be part of small families. But this gets more complicated when you relate it to prenatal sex selective abortions, because some evidence is showing that while prenatal sex selection was earlier happening only for later order children, because the families were bigger and you could just luck it out for the first child and then see what happens for the next few. The incentives now to have small families are much larger, which means prenatal sex selection is happening earlier. And this means that incentive, this sort of human behavior bypasses policy that aims to incentivize small families. So there's good research by the economist S. Anukriti, who shows that incentive schemes in both in Haryana and Rajasthan did not improve, did lower the size of families, but worsened the sex ratio. So as we think about more incentives for small families going forward, this is definitely something we need to think about. I'm just going to end with health here because it leads into COVID, and you can't but talk about COVID now. So all of what we miss with the data is, it can be frustrating, it can be annoying, it can be a lack of nuance, missing the full picture, but sometimes it can be outright dangerous. And I fear that it's likely that that's happening in the case of COVID. It's well established that that's happened in the case of health for women. So what we know from the NSSO from the past is that while in household surveys, while more women report that they are ill or have been ill recently, there's next to no difference in terms of treatment. So that means there are some ill women who are missing out on being on accessing treatment, and expenses on medical treatment for men tend to be higher than for women. It's possible that there are other explanations for this. Men are more likely to be involved in accidents, and the expenses tend to be higher for that, but this is where the averages stand. We have other smaller evidence about gender bias in access to treatments. There's a small study from Orissa, and there's also Mudit Kapoor and Shamika Ravi looked at all OPD visits to AIMS in one calendar year. In 2016, they left out obstetrics and gynecology so that they wouldn't be oversampling women there, and they found men were much likely to visit the OPD than women were. And this is the OPD. This is not trauma. So it as expected, it has. We do see signs of it in COVID already. In When was it? In May 2020, the ICMR released its analysis of its first 1 million RT-PCR COVID tests, and they found that while women were less likely than men to be tested, they were more likely. Sorry, they were not more likely than men to test positive. That there is a clear this is affecting men at a higher level, but women were slightly more likely to test positive than they were to be tested, while men was compared to men. And this, when you see it against sero surveys, that brings up some questions, because sero surveys in Mumbai, for example, have shown that sero prevalence was higher among women than among men. It's likely that a lot of them were asymptomatic, and men are just showing up severe disease. But since we know by now that even asymptomatic COVID patients could have long-term heart and lung damage if completely unchecked, it's this sort of lack of equitable access could have actual real-world danger for women. It's also likely that we're missing some deaths of women, because although women make up 46% of all deaths, as we know from household surveys, they are underrepresented in registered deaths and further underrepresented in medically certified deaths. And this was historically. So we can think about what could be potentially happening now. And as vaccinations start to be rolled out, the lack of equitable access has been a historic problem with health in India, and it's something to consider now. So I'm going to stop over here. I just wanted to raise these issues of what data can tell us, the things that it misses, and how, in the case of COVID, at least, it can have very worrying real life impacts. Um, yeah, open, happy to take questions, and thanks.
Uh, Thanks a lot, Rukmini. So now we are open to question and answers, and to make it intentionally a little engaging, you can indeed just raise your hand in the participants list. I'll just see and I'll ask one by one to ask questions. If you are able to switch on your videos while you ask, that would be great. Yeah, Priyadarshini.
Hi, Rukmini. I just had one clarification. So, what is the difference between voters and electors in one of the slides that you showed us?
So electors are people who are registered to vote, and voters are the people who actually show up to vote.
Okay. Got it.
Yeah, Sagarika.
Thanks, Rukmini. There was this one question that, so, in the crime reporting that you showed, so you said there was underreporting for sexual crimes and overreporting for property crimes. And why do you think, I mean, so the usual narrative that we hear is that people tend to just, file cases against other people for vendetta or whatever, even in personal relationships and so on. So um, data tells something very different from what's happening. So why do you think that works out that way?
So, property crime was not over-reported. It was there was a greater likelihood of property crime being underreported, and a lower likelihood of violent crime being underreported. So, just think about it in your regular life. Theft is so common in India, but the vast majority of theft goes unreported, if it's petty theft in particular. And I think it really, see, if you had a responsible, functioning police system with good oversight, there would be fewer barriers to approaching the police. But as it stands right now, unless you have to, you try to avoid tangling with the police. So I think in the case of violent crime, it seems unavoidable, inevitable. You do need, you do need to report it to get some sort of justice. So there is underreporting of sexual crime as well. The magnitude was smaller, but I think we don't usually see these things in the whole universe of crime. So we do see that there is underreporting of sexual assault, and I don't mean to minimize that. But if you see it in the world of crime, of Indian crime, and reporting of it overall, the underreporting of sexual crime seems to be a smaller problem for this specific point than of, say, property crime. And I have this anecdotally from senior police officials as well. They too feel that things like, one cop actually told me that the only crime that gets properly reported is auto theft, because you need to report it for insurance. So he says, and that's the crime you'll keep, you see the numbers growing. So, and its share of total theft is also growing. His argument is that it's just that you actually you have to report it to for insurance. So his argument was that in all other crime that for which we know that there isn't full registration, which we aren't reporting fully, all increases should be seen as a good thing, because that actually means that you're trying to close that gap of underreporting. Many countries like the UK have a crime victimization survey, which they almost use as a proxy for official statistics, which is a state conducted household survey asking about the experience of crime. We don't have it as a state survey yet. It might happen in the future, but I believe the NCAR is considering conducting a big crime victimization survey.
Yeah, Nikhil and then Priyadarshini.
Yes, thank you, Manas. Thank you, Rukmini, for the presentation. It was very informative. My question is, do we see any change in investment uh, specific to girls or bargaining power of women in the household changing across time? Is there any way to learn about this? Because we see a lot of women-specific schemes coming up. Also, a lot of job opportunities have turned up for women. So, is there any way to measure or learn about how the bargaining power, or even in any household, how the investment for a girl versus a boy has changed?
So I think there's a lot that the data likely doesn't capture here, and there has been change. I wouldn't say that there hasn't. The NCER asked questions about intra household bargaining power, as well as things like having your name on the bank account, owning something in your name, say in purchase of large objects for the house. How much say do you have in that? And they found next to very little change between their first and the second rounds. The second round was conducted in 2011. So we don't have the data for the last 10 years, but there has been that. There's certainly been a big increase in bank accounts for women, I suspect. And whether or not they're empowered to use it, how much actual transactions they're doing is another question, but that's there. There are a number of schemes now that are in the name of the woman only, the LPG scheme, and many state level schemes in which even proposed UBIs, universal basic incomes, or other transfers that are going to be done in the name of the woman alone. So I do think it's likely, it's reasonable to assume that this could mean some improvements in bargaining power. Perhaps it could also mean some allied dangers or resentment, that sort of changes in household dynamics. So I don't think I have a better answer for you on this with any concrete examples of schemes that have shown better bargaining power for women after the transfers being made in the woman's name. But it's reasonable to assume that it could be happening. I mean, I can't fault governments on this. They are aiming to make the woman as the person who receives the transfer or the money or the recipient of the scheme. So it's reasonable to assume that, I think. But there's a number of ways in which things can be circumvented, and they have in the past. So I think the Hindu Succession Act amendment that gave equal inheritance rights to sons and daughters was in 2005, I believe. And I remember a study, maybe a good 10 years after that, that showed next to no, that showed a very low share of women daughters who had, received any inherited property. So there is some circumventing that goes on as well.
Thanks, Rukmini. I actually remember of a study when you were speaking about this. I think researchers went, this is around Haryana, and they went into a village and they said that there are new jobs, call center jobs opening up specifically for women around Gurgaon. And you can see that investment in girls was increasing after just providing that information. Yeah, I just got reminded of that. Thank you.
Yeah, Priyadarshini.
Yeah, no, it's Samir actually.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, so I had a question about the time use survey. I wanted to ask, like, what was the targeted demographic for the survey? Was it predominantly urban or rural? And if it was one and not the other, how would the statistic change if it was?
Yeah, no, so this was conducted by the National Sample Survey Organization. So, 1 lakh households, nationally representative, urban, rural, weighted to actual population, representative at the state level, demographic, all of that. So, there's a lot of frustrations with using government data because sometimes they don't ask the questions you want. The way it's presented is not very fun. There's long gaps in periodicity, but this scale and this sort of reliably nationally representative surveys, hardly anyone else has the resources to do that. So yeah, this was a good one. It came after a gap of 20 years, but yes, because it was the NSSO, it's nationally representative.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, Umesh and then Sumedha.
Yeah, hi Rukmini. So I have one question. So recently the government of Maharashtra has announced that for house purchasing in name of women, there will be reduction in stamp duty. And there is a similar relaxation in revenue duty in while take purchasing land. So do you think such a wealth parity or gap between wealth accumulation will help long-term goal of women empowerment? Is there any empirical evidence about that? Because intuitively it appears, but is there any backing of data for that?
Yeah, I don't have, again, this is something I don't have a good answer on. Intuitively, I agree with you that it does seem to suggest this. There are numerous studies that also show the impact, an increase in domestic violence with increasing assets for women. So, of course, I mean, that doesn't mean that that's a reason to not do these schemes. That isn't what I would argue, but that's a fallout to consider. um, uh, as I said, even for the Hindu Succession Act amendment was meant to be so that you wouldn't need to do these things to bring about parity in assets. But it was the evidence that we have so far is that that was circumvented. I do think that if you introduce a scheme like this and look at it 10 years down the line, it's very likely that you'll see a much higher share registered in the name of women. What it means in terms of operational use and meaningful ownership of assets, that's hard to legislate. That's really something that's social change, and I imagine that I can't imagine legislation leading that. So I do think it's a good. None of this is a reason not to do this. It seems like a good idea to have legislation like this, but I imagine that legislation alone will not drive it. If I can think of specific schemes because I know that there have been similar schemes, or at least of this sort, in other states over time, it's an interesting question for me also to think about. So if I find it, I'll send it along.
Thank you.
Sumedha.
Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for your talk. I got some insights. I had two questions. Sorry, am I audible? Okay. So one is that when you say that, I mean, I understand that you. So if you talk about the data gaps that exist, one of the places where the data gap is very clear is the intra-household the division by nutrition, as in the division in terms of consumption, and how much women consume as well as compared to the males in the family. That's something that is a data gap that a lot of researchers have pointed out, because it helps you study a lot of other outcomes. So since you work with so much of data, if you had to pinpoint one very important place where you would say that we should be collecting more data, or data for different kind in terms of gender, what would it be? That's one question. And the other is that when we look at the gender outcomes, a lot of criticism that gender studies generally kind of receive is the kind of separation between what is an outcome and what is whether the outcome is a result of something else going on. So the establishment of causality is something that is very challenging, particularly for gender, given that it's more of a social problem than it is, than economics can explain out of it. So do you really see anything changing on that end, from that perspective? Those are my two questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the first question. I have never actually, I'm so used to making do with miserly data. I've never really thought of a wish list of what I would like to be collected. But I think if I had that, if I was able to think about it, what I would like is more attitudinal and behavioral questions. We know very little about what people think and why, and what we infer from other things is often very one note, and quite wrong. So one of the things that I think about a lot is how people take decisions. And when I think about this in the context of voting, I think this is actually something that we talk so much about. Hours of television are spent about why, and I don't think we really have a good idea at all, because the way questions are asked in opinion polling, it's sort of the matrix of issues that people think about to decide on things is very poorly captured. So I was talking to someone recently and telling them that I thought that a ranking of reasons is a much better way of asking questions than a single answer. And he was saying that in a country of this size, when you're conducting such large surveys, ranking is too complicated to do. But yeah, I mean, a better answer to why do people, what are the thoughts behind why people vote for whom they do, is something that I think a lot about. One of the things that I think people miss about India, and which anyone would realize the minute you pull away from the data and just think of the most recent conversation you've had with anyone, is that this is a country of ideas and passions. And it often gets reduced to things that analysts think are narratives, which are not necessarily true. So the excel, thinking that um, being offered thinking that being offered a washing machine at the time of voting is something you would vote for, does not necessarily explain everything about you and who you vote for and why. And that's something people get wrong a lot. Saying that you're voting for jobs does not necessarily mean that you don't want to that you don't also want a party that puts Muslims in its place in power. Hindutva attitudes can coexist with saying that you're actually voting for development and jobs. And I think surveys do a poor job of capturing this. Now I've talked so long that I've forgotten your second question. Can you just quickly remind me?
Yeah, so I was asking, I mean, one of the major critiques that I see of, gender studies in general is that, to establish causality from input to outcome, where when you're able to say that this is happening because of, a gender being the social construct that it is, that is something that, these studies are routinely, I mean, it's a routine sort of criticism that I kind of see in the literature. So I'm just wondering if more data would ever solve that problem, or if it's just, if we're just going to have to beat our drums for that much longer for people to get convinced that, it is not just a social problem. I mean, it is a social problem, but then the economics cannot be, you wish you could separate the economics and the social, but you really can't.
Yeah, it's entirely likely that's lacking. There's often examples don't spring to mind right now, but there's often times when I look at averages and then I think, oh, okay, this is what it's saying, and then when you disaggregate, you realize, oh, it's entirely a gender question. So I think again, I'm coming back to elections, but again, I think the 2016 Tamilnadu elections is one example. In the analysis, I can't imagine, if you look or if you talk to people about the elections, I don't think, I mean, people will say yes, women preferred the ADMK at the time, but I don't think it becomes as central to the answer as the numbers show that it should likely be. So yes, but then of course I'm going to use a term that everybody rolls their eyes at now, but there's also the issue of intersectionality within gender, right? So disaggregating something by men and women and expecting that column is what's giving you the answers is highly unlikely. One of the reasons I feel awkward about celebrating or discussing Women's Day, for example, is because I don't need it. It's not for people like me. So I feel the same way about, and that doesn't mean that it shouldn't exist. In fact, it should exist even more, because there's people who need it so much more than me. So I think that's immediately a question. I mean, finding the similar, it's entirely likely that. Uh, that these things actually complicate each other. So you might find that things that advance gender causes, so for example women's reservation, could come at the cost of access to marginalized groups, whether male or female, to positions of power.
Okay, thank you so much. That answers a lot of it.
Yeah, Priyanka, you have a question?
Yes. Rukmini, you pointed out how there are often gaps in data, especially in the realm of gender. So my question is, so how do you, borrowing from the topic, read between the lines? How do data journalists do that? Does it simply come from experience? After seeing different sets of data, you know, okay, or there are something specific that you look for when you are analyzing data?
Yeah, good question. So I think the way journalists can approach it is different from the way researchers can approach it. So the big advantage that I have is that everybody expects a journalist to pick up the phone and call you and ask you things. So talking to experts who know about what you should expect, what you're missing, that's a great advantage that I have as a journalist. The other thing is that a combination of field reporting and number analysis is what gives you the answers. So the reason that I got into that crime analysis at all is because I knew what I had been seeing in police stations and courts over the years. So I think a combination of the two is what tells you when something doesn't sound right, or that there's something that you should be seeing beyond this. So yeah, I mean, I would say to everybody, whenever you're working on something, just pick up the phone and call people who you think might have a better idea of what's going on.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so we have no more raised questions, but if anyone has anything, a last question possibly.
Okay, I'll go. I was waiting for all the data. Thank you so much, Rukmini. This is amazing. Personally, I'm a fan, so I'm very excited. I am from a journalism background, and I wanted to study public policy because I wanted to move into the data journalism space, because I feel like that's, in India right now, that is the only way we do investigative journalism. That's the only way we really look into stories. As someone who's been doing this for a long time now, and what do you see what is the future of data journalism, if I may ask a very broad question? And also, do you feel like it will ever be able to replace what we do right now in journalism? And is there a need to do that at all? So yeah, those would be my questions.
So, well, the future looks good for data journalism, because I definitely sense a need among people to have numbers that cut through narratives, that cut through rhetoric. But I don't want to over romanticize this either, which is that all of the problems that plague journalism plague data journalism as well. So one of the at least one of my sort of driving forces is that there's a lot of living in ideological bubbles that's going on right now, and I think a lot of journalists are trying either consciously or unconsciously to push through those bubbles and get through to people, get beyond echo chambers. But just as you find that people will only read and believe the news that they want to, that can work for data journalism as well. There's now, a bunch of ideologically charged outlets that will do what they call data journalism too. So I wouldn't necessarily say that data journalism is showing your rough work, putting out your data sources, maybe even your analysis, and leaving it so that people know that you've not been cherry picking numbers to suit your narrative or torturing the data to confess, as they say, is something that could help build credibility, because there is a credibility crisis in journalism for sure, and there's no particular reason to think that that doesn't apply to data as well. I think one of the things that's also happening is that some newsrooms are now seeing teams of people with tech skills and journalism skills, so that helps sort of access larger data sets to tell bigger stories. But here's the thing, without the data, there's nothing you can do without the raw material. And the more that governments withhold data or falsify, our jobs are going to get that much harder. So that job in a way remains the core principle of journalism, and it's not necessarily data journalists like me who are going to get that data out, but journalists who might even see themselves as just journalists who cover ministries that happen to give out data, but they are the ones who are really pushing the governments to release this information. So, for example, there's a journalist called Somesh Jha, who was earlier with Business Standard and now with Bloomberg Quint. And his job was to cover the Ministry of Statistics and program implementation, which is not the most glamorous of ministries. And he had a couple of other ministry beats as well. So, but the way he approached this, his beat is really fantastic, which is that he wouldn't just take down sort of the press releases of what they were giving out, and he tracked down all the reports that were being held back, leaked it himself, was pushed back against by the government, and then they had to formally release exactly the same report that they had just spent a few months denying. So, is he a data journalist? Maybe not, but did he do the work of releasing the data so that all of us can do journalism? Yes, he did. So, the problem might be journalism, but potentially the answer could also be journalism itself.
Thank you for that.
That's both a good question as well as a good answer to as an end note. So I would like to thank Rukmini to you for doing this and coming and talking to all of us. And this is exactly what we as a team had imagined. And I believe the reason for you telling us to make it more engaging so that people can directly ask questions